Welcome to today's explainer. We're tackling a word that gets thrown around a lot these days, fascism. But instead of just tossing it into the ring as a generic insult, we're going to break down a brilliant source paper that offers a strict, dual-lens method for analyzing it. You see, the central challenge historians and political scientists face is defining this highly charged concept with absolute precision. So how do we actually do that without getting lost in the weeds?
Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. We'll start with the definition problem, look at 2 ways to analyze it, unpack the fascist minimum core, and then explore the broad maximal field. After that, we'll ground this in a case study of Nazi Germany, and finally, we'll rethink anti-fascist analysis. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. The definition problem.
So what exactly is fascism? Seriously, take a second and think about it. We hear the word all the time, right? But in the academic world, it represents a very specific object of historical explanation. It's not just some catch-all label for politics we don't like, or something we just intuitively feel in our gut. We need a precise way to measure it. And here is where we hit a massive roadblock: the tension of definition. If we go too broad, while suddenly every violent or authoritarian state gets slapped with the fascist label, the word loses all its discriminating force. It becomes practically meaningless. But on the flip side, if we make the definition too narrow, we'd only spot fascism when it's already a fully completed regime, with the camps, the uniforms, the mass rallies, and by then we're way too late. A solid analysis absolutely has to avoid both of these extremes.
Moving on to Section 2, 2 ways to analyze.
To solve this problem, the paper suggests looking at it kind of like a medical diagnosis. First up, we've got the defining, or taxonomic approach. This looks for the strong minimal definition. Basically, what is the exact invariant core that absolutely must be present for a genuine instance of the concept? But then, on the other side, there's the constraining, or strategic approach. This uses a weak maximal definition to map out a broad hazard field of early symptoms. It tells us where the concept can start to form. And the big takeaway here? To truly understand the topic, we actually need to use both of these lenses at the exact same time.
Section 3. The fascist minimum core.
All right, looking through that first lens, our core definition comes from political theorist Roger Griffin. He calls it Palingenetic Ultranationalism. Now, don't let that $50 word scare you off. Palingenetic literally just means rebirth. The source makes a fascinating point here. Without this core myth of national or ethnic rebirth from some supposed decay, you might have a brutal dictatorship. Sure, you might have rampant racism or militarism, but you do not yet have generic fascism. It requires a promise of a revolutionary rupture, a totally clean slate, not just your standard conservatism. So how does that logic actually play out in the real world? I mean, every political party wants power, right? But fascism answers the question, power for whom, by claiming it for an imagined, reborn national body. It promises this absolute organic unity after a period of deep humiliation. And here's the dark part. It identifies internal enemies not as normal political opponents, but as actual pollutants that need to be completely purged from the social body. Redemptive violence is then used as a way to literally burn away decadence. It's a truth-making process for them. This right here, this is the absolute, non-negotiable minimum core.
Section 4. The broad maximal field.
Now, let's switch to that second lens, drawing on thinkers like Umberto and Robert Paxton to map out the early symptoms. We're talking about a cult of action just for action's sake, an intense fear of difference, an obsession with secret plots, and a really deep nostalgia for a lost wholeness. But hey, it's super important to remember, this is not just a simple checklist. Any one of these things can exist entirely on its own outside of fascism, but when you put them together, they create a sort of symptom space, a hazard field that lays down the tracks for mobilization to actually get rolling.
And this brilliantly illustrates why that broader lens is so absolutely crucial. Fascism rarely, if ever, just announces itself as a completed regime on day one. It bubbles up through a substrate of minor myths, nostalgia, discipline fantasies, media spectacles, and stories of national decline. If you just sit around waiting for the strongest criteria of a totalitarian state to show up before you start diagnosing it, you are going to completely miss the social groundwork that made the regime possible in the first place.
Section 5. Case study. Nazi Germany.
Let's ground all this heavy theory by looking at how it actually built up historically. Way back in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles created this massive, broad, maximal field of humiliation and grievance in Germany. But watch how that grievance gets narrowed over time. By the 1920 Nazi Party program, they're actively cultivating the stab-in-the-back betrayal myth and demanding a racially defined rebirth. Fast forward to 1933, they seize power and consolidate everything around the Führer cult. Then, boom, 1935, the Nuremberg laws lock that myth into rigid institutional exclusion. You can literally watch those broad, messy social symptoms harden into that strict, minimal core.
Right at the heart of this whole thing was a crucial concept: Volksgemeinschaft, which translates to the people's community. According to the source, this was the imagined body of regenerated German unity. It was the glue used to unify the masses, while simultaneously aggressively excluding anyone they deemed undesirable. Interestingly, the Führer cult actually solved a functional problem for them, because they viewed ordinary democratic pluralism, like having different political parties and labor unions, as a literal disease dividing the nation. They replaced all that messy diversity with a single, tribalized will.
Just look at this piece of primary evidence from Joseph Goebbels at the 1933 Nuremberg rally. He flat out calls the movement a revolution born from national suffering and democratic decay. It perfectly captures how the regime sold its own story to the public. They weren't pitching themselves as just some ordinary government coming in to tweak tax policy. They framed it as a Palingenetic revolution, swooping in to rescue the nation from total collapse.
So if we sum up that historical mechanism, there is a shockingly clear path from substrate to regime. Step 1. Exploit broad social symptoms and humiliation. Step 2. Cultivate a powerful myth of betrayal. Step 3. Bind all that energy into a promise of national rebirth. And finally, institutionalize it. All that early opportunism and broad right-wing anger, it only became strictly fascist once it was tightly organized around that core myth of ultranationalist purification. It's a very specific binding process.
Section 6. Rethinking Anti-Fascist Analyses.
So where does this leave us today? Well, the paper concludes that analysts actually need to operate in two distinct registers at the same time. In the definitional register, you've got to be incredibly precise. To accurately classify a threat, you ask, is power being gathered for a reborn, purified national body? But over in the strategic register, there you have to be broad. You're looking for early detection by watching the substrate, things like anti-intellectualism, betrayal myths, demands for organic unity. Think of it this way: the narrow lens classifies, but the broad lens detects.
And here is a genuinely surprising takeaway from the research. This substrate can hide under some totally non-obvious aesthetics. It doesn't always look like angry, militarized rallies. Believe it or not, it can actually present itself within pastoral, ecological, or communitarian movements. The aesthetic softness of wanting a better future, say through community gardens or getting back to nature, doesn't magically prevent a fascist form from taking root, provided the underlying logic is still heavily focused on exclusionary rebirth and blaming a lost wholeness on some contaminating enemy. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this explainer. The next time you're observing a political movement, the best diagnostic question you can ask yourself isn't just, is this authoritarian or are they violent? It's actually this: is power being gathered for rebirth? Keep that analytical tool in your back pocket, and you'll be able to evaluate political formations with a whole new level of clarity. So the next time you see a movement calling for a return to a mythical past, what exactly are they trying to purify?